Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks, Ryan, for being with us. Today, we're going to spend some time gathering in gratitude about the topics of nature's abundance. And then we will be sharing this as a recording, which I'm just grateful for the opportunity to do this. My name is Justine Johnson. I'm the Associate Director, Kirkridge Retreat and Study Center. And I'm joined by Ryan and our neighbors on the Blue Mountain or Kittatinny Ridge. I want to take a moment just to honor this land, this beautiful space that we are neighbors on, and recognize the Indigenous peoples who came before, the Lenape communities, and now we host spaces for gatherings on this beautiful chunk of land that we have, located near Bangor and Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. Kirkridge Retreat and Study Center is retreat center with 4 buildings, and because of COVID-19 we've had to close our physical spaces and we've transitioned online, which has really just created more opportunities to widen our circle, have different kinds of conversations, and bring people together in community and gather in gratitude, hence this title, especially around nature's abundance. Kirkridge has 170 acres of land. Much of it is in nature conservancy and land easement. And then also our space provides trails to walk the land. We have a joint labyrinth with our neighbors, and exciting this year, a farm, a little garden for us to harvest, which we will be talking about. Ryan, would you like to introduce yourself in Columcille?
Oh, I'd love to. And just thank you so much for reaching out and collaborating with us as neighbors on this project. It's been an awful lot of fun. I'm Ryan Sullivan. I am a board member of Columcille Megalith Park, which, as Justine said, is just down the mountain from Kirkridge. We were founded more than 40 years ago based on a dream our founder, the Reverend William H. Cohey Jr., had while on the island of Iona off the Scottish coast. He came back to the Blue Mountain here in Pennsylvania and began to enact that dream, and eventually it became Columcille. We are a private nonprofit park on just about 20 acres, all of it, or nearly all of it, in conservancy as well. Columcille Megalith Park is rooted in Celtic and Irish history and spirituality, but was really created as a place to nourish the spirit and soul of the humans that walk its land and look at the stones. We have 90 plus megaliths, large stone settings, some of which measure more than 10 tons in weight and more than 30 feet in height. We're open dawn to dusk every day of the year, and we're open for visitation, private visitors. We aren't doing the events and celebrations we normally do because of COVID, and we look very much forward to resuming that cycle when we may. I have a background in a bachelor's degree in political science and religious studies, a master's degree in family counseling, and an educational specialist degree in pretty much whatever I want to say it's in. I first got to the park 20 plus years ago and met the founder, Bill Cohey, who became a dear personal friend, a mentor and spiritual guide in my life. And I was lucky enough to have that friendship for 2 decades. I have been involved in programming at the park and stepped up onto the board after Bill's passing. And I'm just so excited to be part of the team that's forging the future of Columcille. And such a huge part of that future is our relationship with and our partnerships with Kirkridge up the mountain. So welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so glad you could be here today.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for introducing yourself in Columcille. So today we're going to have some time. I just want to lay it out a little bit to introduce ourselves. So I'm grateful for Ryan. We've learned a lot about ourselves in this planning. This is part 1 of 4 gatherings we hope to have that you'll be able to find more information out with a project supported by Audubon and the Kittatinny Ridge grant. And we'd love to be physically together on this land, and we hope to do that soon. And for right now, we're providing programs online virtually as kind of a teaser almost to say, here's the information we gather, here's how we love the land in our own unique ways and together. And then we hopefully in 2021 will come together at Columcille, Kirkridge, and the Appalachian Trail, which crosses Kirkridge's property, and really love the land together to apply what we're learning into the physical space together. But for today, we're going to talk about nature's abundance, the harvest season, and some Celtic spirituality. And so Ryan will lead us in that conversation, and I'll close out with some activities and prompts that we can use today, tomorrow, in 6 months, whenever we can turn back to this. So Ryan, I'll just let you take it away from here.
All right, fantastic, and thank you so much. Also, just a note, the Irish pronunciation of Columcille, the park's name, is the name of Saint Columba in his westernized name. In Irish, he would have been Columcille, and that's where the name came from. We have a number of different pronunciations. Our founder called it Columcille for years. Many people have called it Columcille. And our current board president, who is an Irish scholar, said, no, it's Columcille. So we'll take any of the three.
Thanks, Ryan.
I know it's confusing for a lot of people. So much of our understanding of harvest time and of this Celtic holiday of Lughnasadh is rooted in the origins of the Celtic peoples, the origins, in fact, of the very human race. What you're looking at on your screen at the moment is a composite image of the modern world at night. You can see all throughout the world, it's lit by lightning, to borrow the words of Tennessee Williams. Light abounds. And with that light, produced by electricity in so many cases today, comes a level of connection, a level of speed, a level of instantaneous communication, thought, expectation, and the pace of the world has sped up. Our origins as humans and the origins of so many of our traditions didn't start in that world, didn't start in the world of telephones, of televideo, of satellite communications. So for a moment, close your eyes and imagine all of those points of light have gone out. The only light you would see from space 5,000 years ago would be a fire large enough to be seen, so a forest fire perhaps somewhere in North America or Northern Asia. Somewhere in the tip of South America, the forests of the savanna of Africa. But beyond that, it would have been dark. The two primal forces of that time would have been light and dark. Our ancestors would have lived in this, and if you have never experienced the dark that one finds outside of a city, the phrase "cannot see a hand in front of your face" is quite literal. Get a couple of 100 yards into any heavy forest on a cloudy night, and you cannot see anything. Dark and light were tangible forces. That's why they had gods associated to them to help explain, to help give humans some brief illusion of control or a way to influence these primal forces. When the dark came, you couldn't see. The only light you would have would be from what fire you could make, and eventually torches and candles and the other technologies we humans developed. But at the start of it all, you had dark, you had light. And from that day and night, caused by the turning of the earth and the spinning on its axis, you had heating and cooling. That heating and cooling leads to weather, and beyond weather to the seasons. Light and dark lead to the varied seasons, and the seasons, and understanding and observing the seasons are part of what we assume allowed our ancestors to develop the first agricultural practices. And I suspect not long after that, the first ways to party, because the agriculture was done. One of the things we have a trouble with, and by we in this case I mean scholars of the ancient world, is something called data paucity. There's just not a lot of information about the ancient past. I've heard it compared to getting 4 or 5 pieces of a 200-piece puzzle, and from those 5 pieces being able to describe in detail what the entire picture looks like. We have an ancient song here. Interestingly enough, ancient Scottish ballads, the best source for accurate ancient Scottish songs are the Appalachian Highlands of America, where some of the culture preserved little snippets of the ancient past. Holdover festival traditions, the stories we tell can tell us a lot about the past. And then, of course, there is archaeological evidence. But all of it comes in bits and pieces. All of it comes in dribs and drabs. And so as I talk about this festival of Lughnasadh and the cycle of the Celtic year and the Celtic peoples, know that a lot of it is educated guesswork. Try to acknowledge that where we can. We do know some things, but most of it is reconstructed. We're making our best guesses. So I used a name there, and it was the Celts. Who were the Celts? Celts are a way we modern folk have of talking about a group of peoples linked by language and culture that lived in Europe and were a dominant cultural force in Europe for more than 1,500 years and over millions of square miles. This map shows Celtic influence in Europe from about 800 BCE up to about the time of the conquest of Caesar, of the Gaulish peoples, so somewhere around 50. The culture, the Hallstatt culture, is named such because of an archaeological find in Austria, where many of the artifacts recovered date from somewhere around 500 years ago. The Latin find is more modern than that, but still in the time period of BCE. It's important to understand that when we talk about the Celts, there is no way we can say anything about a people that lived over that much space over that much time. There were many different tribes. They were linked by similar customs and similar languages, but it's a fallacy to talk about the ancient Celtic peoples. We can make some broad stroke generalities. We can see commonalities between some of the cultures, but the reality is someone living in the Alps in 1,000 years BCE probably had very different beliefs and a very different life than someone living around Marseille, France, say 250 BCE. In general, though, we know that the Celtic language is one of the Indo-European language groups. We know that the peoples that would become the Celts of Europe arose somewhere, we believe, around the headwaters of the Danube in Eastern Europe or Western Asia. We know we have cultural and language similarities between the Celtic peoples of Europe and some of the earliest inhabitants of northern India. What we also know is, as one can generally see a migrational pattern as Celtic peoples moved from the east to the west, in many cases pushed out by some other tribe, some other group, oftentimes Celtic themselves. They migrated across all of Europe and finally even so far as Ireland. As I mentioned at the beginning, Columcille is rooted in Irish history and myth first, and the Celtic world as we understand it more generally. The first time we hear the term Celt or Keltoi comes from the Greeks in the 6th century BCE, and they were referring to peoples that were living to the north and northwest of them. In the Christian Bible, in the New Testament, there is an epistle of Paul to the Galatians. The Galatians were a people that lived in what would be modern-day Turkey and Asia Minor. The Galatians were a Celtic peoples as well. So again, we had a 1,000-year period in Europe where there would have been some cultural linkage, some commonality of language, at least major words, major concepts. This migration eventually led to the settlement of Ireland. And if we could have the next slide, Justine, that'd be fantastic. Now, at this point, I want to mention that my pronunciation of modern Irish is poor. of Middle Irish is bad, and of Old Irish, well, doesn't bear speaking about. So I won't even try to mangle many of these names. The best source we have for the ancient history of Ireland, or one of the sources, one of the only sources we had for years, and one that was considered to be a fair, decent history until modern times, is known as the Book of Invasions. And it was first put together, we think, somewhere in the 11th century by Christian Irish monks. What this book, be it pure fictional storytelling or not, and as we know, a lot of these old ancient stories have kernels of truth, kernels of what actually happened in there. It tells of a sequence of invasions of Ireland. First, by Cessair, Partholon, and Neved. Now, each of these three people, there was time in between the invasions, and according to the monks, each of the three could trace their ancestry back to descendants of Noah. In this case, one of his daughter of Bith, or Partholon and Neved were related, traced their lineage back to Magog. The Fir Bolg were actually Nemedians who had been captured and carried off and had returned to Ireland. And the name Fir Bolg means men of the bag. So Ireland's had bagmen for thousands of years. The Tuatha De Danann are one of those mythological races that borrows godlike and certainly are identified as Irish gods in some sources, but are also talked about as having human passions and struggles and farming and other things. So whenever we deal with mythology, whenever we deal with Irish stories, not only are there 6 contradictory stories for every figure or god, but that's okay. The Irish could hold multiple things in their heads at once. So again, it's hard to speak with any authority, and certainly you're not arguing that this was a literal invasion by people. But the Tuatha De Danann are mythological figures, godlike beings. And then the Milesians, the sons of Miel, our best guess is were Celto-Iberians. So emigrating from the northeastern coast of Spain or Portugal, most likely. In the stories, the Milesians fought the Tuatha De Danann, eventually proving victorious, and in a deal, they agreed to split Ireland. The Milesians, the sons of Miel, would take above ground. They would take the land, the sky, the seas. The Tuatha De Danann would take the underworld, the other world, and the she-mounds, the fairy mounds. The Tuatha, as they're often called, are the roots of many of the Irish fairy stories. The Irish fairy Queen Mab, for instance, is referring to one of those figures. The figure that's pertinent to us, though, here today is Lugh. Lugh, or Lugh Lámfada, which means Lugh of the long arm, was one of the most major deities, according to writings of the time. Caesar identified him with the Roman god Jupiter as the head of. Now, probably not a clear one-to-one relationship, but what you see before you are 3 images of Lugh. The leftmost and the rightmost depict Lugh, or Lugh in battle, the rightmost showing one of his magical items, his mystical items, a mighty spear that would slay his enemies. The middle one is a recovered relief carving, and if you look closely, you can see 3 faces on his head. Many of the Irish gods were depicted as what are known as tripartite, or having 3 parts. It's one of the reasons Padraig was able to transmit the idea of the Christian Trinity so easily to the pagan Irish. They already believed in 3-part gods. There are many, many stories of Lugh, and if you'd like a little more information, you can look at a play that we presented at Lughnasadh Past at Columcille called Against the Blight. It tells the story of Lugh and Balor. Essentially, Balor was a Fomorian. He was another race of Ireland. They were the evil mythological figures. They represented disease and blight and corruption. And one of the stories that gets told about Lugh is that he is Baelor's grandson. He was, in fact, there was a prophecy that he would kill his grandfather one day. Lugh grew up at the court of Manannán mac Lir, the god of the sea. And when he had grown and gained his skill, he went to gain entrance at the court of Nuada of the Silver Arm, the king of Ireland. He approached the court of Nuada and was rebuffed. They said, "What have you to offer us? For we only want those to join us that have something to offer, who will join in our strength and make it greater." And Lugh said, "Well, I am an accomplished poet and singer." And they said, "We have one of those." He said, "Oh, well, I am a mighty warrior." They said, "We have those." He says, "Well, I'm a smith of renown. There's nothing I cannot forge." Yeah, we have a couple of those. I am an incredible farmer. And I said, "We have those." Well, Lugh has got a little frustrated, but he takes a moment and thinks, and then smiles and asks, "But do you have anyone who can do all of those things?" And indeed they did not. And Lugh became a member of the court of Nuada of the Silver Arm. We mention Lugh because the festival part of the Celtic year that we are celebrating is the festival of Lughnasadh. It is Lugh's day. Could we have the next slide, please? This is a representation of what is known as the Wheel of the Year. It's a way of talking about a cycle, a way of looking at the flow of a year and dividing it up into 8 holidays based on the natural rhythms. Please understand that this Wheel of the Year concept is not something the ancient Celts necessarily had. The idea of a Wheel of the Year and the blending together of these different European festivals really occurred in the late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, with writers such as Mead and Fraser and thinkers, writers, and religious creationists like Gerald Gardner and Ross Nichols in England. What we do know is that for at least 5,000 years, human beings were aware of and been able to predict the solstices and equinoxes. We know to the ancient Celts, those days which fell between the solstices and equinoxes, the cross-quarter days, were more important. Now, the cross-quarter days are the days of the celebrations of Bealtaine, or May Day, Lammas Lughnasadh, beginning of August, Samhain, what modern world celebrates as Halloween, at the end of October, and Imbolc at the beginning of February. What we do know about the Celts for sure, and speaking again, as I rarely do about that entire length of time, is that light and dark were incredibly important. Day consisted of night and day. The year consisted of winter and summer. Day began with sunset and night, and the year began with winter at Samhain. Pardon me, just one moment. This understanding of a cyclical nature of the year also allowed them to become an agricultural people, to understand when in the cycle of their year they had to plant and when to harvest. And as almost every ancient culture did, stories about planting time and harvest time arose. Celebrations to celebrate a successful planting, to entreat the powers that be, the gods of their understanding, for fruitful crops and fertile fields. Celebrations arose. When it came time to bring in those crops, you again invoked the gods of our understanding to ask that the bounty come in. Celebrations were born, carried on, and we continue to move forward. Lughnasadh, we do know, was celebrated in ancient times. In ancient times, we have several stories of great festivals and games that were held in Ireland. in honor of the god Lugh. We know there would have been rituals and activities involving freshly harvested grain, or perhaps anthropomorphic figures made from corn husks and wheat, the sheaves of wheat and the discarded straw. But again, because of data paucity, we don't know exactly what those look like. At Columcille, we try to recreate some of these celebrations, and we weave in modern meaning. And frankly, that's what I encourage you to do. Whatever celebration is important to you, wherever it arose, it becomes most relevant when we weave in elements from our lives and from our experiences. We do know that there are modern celebrations of Lughnasadh all over Europe, all over America, and indeed all over the world. Because Lughnasadh has become a concept in new religious movements such as Druidry and Wicca within the larger context of neo-paganism, many people who may not have a single drop of heritage or genetic material from Northern Europe will celebrate these holidays because something in the ritual, something in the meaning speaks to their heart, to their soul, and brings meaning in their life. One of the things I encourage people to think about at Lughnasadh, we are now at a point where we are past the solstice, so our days are getting shorter. The heat, in many ways, feels like we're at midsummer, so it's sometimes hard to think about harvest. But at this point of the year, we have turned. We are beginning to progress towards the dark and towards the cold again. And the crops that we put in the ground, prayed and danced for in the spring, the first of them are coming ripe. In Europe, it would be blueberries, early wheats. Around here, thank you so much, Justine. Where I live, my tomatoes are in season, my cantaloupe, my corn, my peppers. And I'm harvesting them and enjoying those. And that is a literal harvest of food. But harvest isn't just a yearly agricultural season. Harvest, as we talk about it, means a gathering in of that which nourishes us. And let's face it, in the modern world, very few people farm. Very few people are nourished entirely by what they're able to produce on their land or bring home from the world around them. Instead, we are nourished in more esoteric ways. We still need the same physical nourishment. I argue we still need the same psychic and emotional nourishment, but we find them in different places. In nature, there is a season for harvest that's based on a yearly cycle of day and night, of warmth and cold. But in the projects of your personal life and the things which you are doing to try to nourish yourself, maybe it doesn't fall on an annual cycle. Maybe it's just a 1 week cycle. You plant, you nourish, and you harvest all in 1 week. Maybe it's a multi-year cycle or a cycle of a lifetime. It's important to remember that whenever your harvest is, don't rush to it and don't ignore it. Listen to the signs and bring in what you need to nourish yourself in the proper time. One of the things I want to mention, a way to think about this, is we use language of growing when we talk about human relationships. We speak of cultivating friendships. Human beings are social creatures. We are interdependent creatures. When we cultivate a friendship, when it comes time to harvest, and I'm not talking Hannibal Lecter type harvest here, when it comes time to harvest, that harvest is when we can lean on them, when we can rely on someone else's energy, their thought, their contribution to the stew pot that is our life. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. There's a reason we cultivate those relationships. Paying attention to the balance of light and dark, how that plays in, paying attention to the balance of forces in whatever your growing project is important for a healthy harvest. The last thing I want to remind you is we're talking about abundance. We're talking about the natural abundance of our world. And I'll bet that's jarring a little bit in this time when I know I'm worried about the abundance for me and my family this year and our disruption. I know a lot of people are worried, but I argue that this is a time to look to nature and find nature's abundance. It's even more important to do it now. There are lessons waiting there, and you never know when something you see and something you think about may help shift that actual abundance or scarcity in your own life. You may say, but I'm in a city. I do not care if you live in the middle of a dense forest 100 miles from anywhere or on the 75th floor of a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan or Dubai, Singapore. Everywhere there is nature, even in the most dense urban environment. I was in New York City recently and I saw at least a dozen different species. Yes, 2 of them were common sewer rat and pigeon, but there was more than that. There were trees on every street. And where there weren't trees, maybe there were some weeds poking up through the crack. A vast park in the middle of the city where people go to bird watch and where one can watch the interplay of natural creatures. Wherever you are, you should be able, I hope you can see the sun, the sky, the stars, maybe, or the moon. The stars, the sun, the moon, these are nature too. They're the systems and the patterns that underlie the green, growing, yelping, running, fighting, and dying nature that we see all around us. And paying attention to how they flow. You'll notice we're moving into the time where you'll be able to really notice a difference in the length of day. You'll notice the sun is rising and setting minutes different than the days before. And by the time a month has gone by, we'll have lost nearly an hour of daylight. These changes in daylight bring changes in temperature, bring changes in plants. It's an opportunity to look at the world around us and see what lessons are waiting for us to understand.
Ryan, I think there's so many lessons within all of the information you shared, which I'm grateful for because this is a new grouping of knowledge sharing that I'm unfamiliar with. So it is like a beautiful, you started at modern, weaved in historical references, and then also came back to how we can apply these lessons in this time. And in these new times for us, I think specifically in the US, of course, still grappling with COVID, a resurgence of social justice and Black Lives Matter. And then there's also this newer response to COVID about getting back to nature, the scarcity of, supply and demand, so growing food, and then intersecting with land and Black Lives Matter and land reparations. There's so much right now that we can learn from nature in how to give, how to receive, how to live in abundance, even when we're met with scarcity. Like all of these messages I'm seeing in what you're saying and now how they're playing out in modern times at July 31st, 2020, right? As we go in August 1st for Lughnasadh, these are still very tangible and real lessons that we can apply in any lived experience, right? So that's beautiful. Yeah. And I love the play of words of harvest and how we do that as humans. And so I think about agricultural season and the planting, right? Like what seeds do you plant? And I say agricultural season, but it's season of your life. You're talking about a week, a multi-year. What seeds do you plant? What are you cultivating? What are you harvesting? And what are you storing away? So I love that imagery for community, individual, and actual land.
Such rich imagery, metaphor, room to work metaphor, and whimsy within the natural world and what we can just observe.
Absolutely. And so I think the question upon us is how to recognize the harvest season, what to do about that. And so there's many activities. I think, Ryan, you already mentioned so many of these, so I'll just reiterate. But the one we started and we hopefully will end with is giving gratitude for the abundance in your life. And to me, that's a reframe that may be difficult for some of us to find. And it might just be gratitude to the food on the table that evening, to that you get to see the sun, that COVID-19 has challenged us to slow down. And for some, it hasn't. For essential workers and activists and advocates, it's also challenged us to commit to the long game. And what is the reframe in that? So this morning, as I was picking raspberries, thinking about this presentation, and also thinking about Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, thanking the raspberries and being grateful to have that time carved out for myself, to have that food, to be able to identify it, to be able to walk the space. There was so much I was able to be grateful for. And also be grateful for leaving some of the berries on the bush. And that's part of it too, being able to give and receive and not move from scarcity, not take everything, right? But be grateful for what I can have.
And that's such a great point, because we often overlook that what is left over from our abundance nourishes many other levels and many other layers as well.
Yeah, thank you. That, I think abundance is another thread. See, my second bullet point was cut off, but continue to learn, read, and harvest learnings from Indigenous and ancestral communities. So we just had this beautiful weaving of a historical narrative from some people who identify within that ancestral lineage, and knowing that there are so many other Indigenous and ancestral knowledges or learnings that are out there. You know, how can we learn and respond, and of course not steal? I want to be mindful of that, right? That there's learning, and we should recognize that by naming what community we've learned from. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Ryan, I thought when you and I were talking about this, just sitting and reflecting for a moment of abundance, but also of your life, of looking out your window and hopefully seeing the sun or the stars, smelling the fresh air, seeing how the season is changing, seeing what you can harvest from nature, from your own life, and from your community. I really enjoyed that, because I usually think of harvest as a go time, like moving quickly, you know, reaping the benefits of what you've sown before. But this was also taking in some reflection. So thank you for that. And then Ryan and I both talked about this, but actually harvesting, maybe you have access to a garden or a community supported agricultural CSA, and maybe you don't. Maybe you only have access to a farmer's market, or maybe you don't have that too, you know, which is a social justice issue, thinking about food deserts and looking at where our food comes from. So that critical engagement component of harvesting is really important. I think maybe Ryan, you can speak to this one. I was looking up activities specifically for Lughnasadh, and I was like, cook with seasonal foods, pick the berries, and have a feast, like rejoice in abundance. Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, just that you're right. Harvest time was very bustly. It was hard work. You have to make hay while the sun is shining. In other words, you got to get it cut and dried before it rains on you, or you lose your winter's food for your animals. So there is a bustle, which makes those breaks, those momentary pauses to celebrate or reflect, so very important. For Lughnasadh, a lot of the work would have been getting grain in. So some traditional foods associated with Lughnasadh would be breads or pastas, or the fresh fruits that may be coming ripe in your area, if you are lucky enough and privileged enough to be able to access those.
That's great. Thank you, Ryan. Ryan, you also mentioned that Columcille is open, even though there's not sponsored events and large gatherings, that people are invited to walk the land. And I encourage everyone to do that if you're near or far. And I put an abbreviation in there, sorry. So the Appalachian Trail is also within a mile of Columcille, which I believe is reopening in some spaces, but I have seen a lot of people in COVID, again, reconnect with land and walk the trails. And I would encourage anyone, if you're not near these spaces, to just walk or move or bicycle or just sit, also be outside.
Well, that's where the counselor, the therapist in me also wants to point out that the single greatest thing any one of us can do to help regulate mood is walk in nature. Even better if the sun is shining on you a little bit.
That's right. I think, again, given our values at both of our organizations, the last two are also important, talking about sharing your harvest. And that might mean abundance of relationships or financially or with your food. We were just talking before we started this that I just pulled a mammoth zucchini, right? Because you always have mammoth zucchinis. They always sneak up on you. So who
And a
can we
lot of them.
share food, love, and labor with? It's a good time to recognize maybe that many of us are living in abundance and many of us are not. So how can we share that? And then finally, something that I think has been highlighted and re-highlighted and now centered is increasing access and equity to the outdoors and decentering whiteness. I'm thankful that this is part of the conversation. So, and it's a large conversation, so I won't do it justice today, but how do we encourage all outdoor spaces, all spaces, in fact, to be equitable and ensure everyone feels safe, welcome, and comfortable in that? I think for us, knowing ancestral and indigenous histories is really important. Also, knowing true stories of natural landscapes is vital as how we view that space and who's invited into that space. There are always more than one narrative or one story to share. So doing research and learning from that. Welcoming all people into natural spaces. Again, it's just like welcoming all people into any space. We are sharing this. That's inviting people who are privileged to know that it is not a finite source of power that we should share. We have an obligation to each other, and we encourage, I identify as white, so I encourage myself to be accountable to that and other white people. And again, the continuous learning and unlearning. Ryan, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, all I was going to say is, in terms of that last point, which I do believe is critically important, one of, nature can provide us lessons, but looking at the history and the patterns of humans also offers something. And it may be important to remember that the idea of land ownership has gotten human beings into an awful lot of trouble over the years. And I only bring it up because we talked about the waves of migration. All of us, every human in the world, is living someplace other than where we began. We're probably living someplace different than our ancestors were 500 years ago, 1,000, 1,500, or 1,000,000. And so understanding that the land has its stories, I was so glad to hear you say that, yes, it's important to honor those narratives. And I think it is really important to remember that the land, nature, was here before us, it tolerates us presently, and it'll be here after us in whatever form. And we need to honor that many have come before and likely many will come after us standing on this. So how dare we claim it in some absolute sense as ours?
Thank you for that add-on, Ryan. I think there's so much dynamic history living into the current present and what we can learn is how we form moving forward, specifically all identities and their relationship to nature. And that there are some lived identities that have trauma around natural spaces, given specifically the United States history. So I think that's important and something that Kirkridge and Columcille will continue to discuss and learn. It's a continuous learning process for us. And this was such a learning process. And so where do we go from here? Since Ryan and I mostly Ryan, dumped a bunch of knowledge. And what I love is that this is recorded so we can replay as there's just like little morsels that I'm going to want to sit with. And part of this was engaging your knowledge from within about what you're doing for Lughnasadh or harvest season or continuously through the year. And one I would encourage is recognizing the seasonal or the seasons and how that informs your way of being and knowing. And you can use these prompts throughout. If you were to journal, if you were to walk, however you kind of find that time for yourself, these are the questions we're going to leave you with before we close. What are you harvesting at this time? I think Ryan put that beautifully through literal harvesting, harvesting within yourself and with others. What changes are you feeling and experiencing as the seasons start to change? How are you growing during this time? Where are you finding balance in that growth? And what are you maybe letting go of? And finally, what nourishes you? And how can you create more time and space for that? I think these are questions that are open for you to dissect continuously. We would traditionally, if we were meeting on the land in this space, give you quite a bit of time to reflect and then share back and reflect and share back. And we encourage you to do that on your own during this time. Of course, Ryan and I would love to hear your insights, knowing that that may happen. And that, you know, maybe every year from now on, we'll look back at this and say, wow, this has been amazing how it changes. And yet what stayed the same?
Look at what has come from the seed.
Nice. Love that. Yeah. So as we close, Ryan, do you want to add anything and speak to any poem or tidbit you have?
Yeah. This is just a few lines by William Wordsworth, which said they wanted to be here today. There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth, and every common sight to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. And in closing, for my part, and from Columcille, I would have been offering this at the end of our celebration, which we unfortunately are not able to have. May sun, wind, and stars baptize you anew each day. May the wind lift you up and the sun warm your face, and may you know peace.
That's
Thanks.
lovely. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and ancestral knowledge with us. This was wonderful, and I think one of the first steps in our continued journey as neighbors on the mountain. I'm just so grateful for this. And so we will continue to share and learn with each other. And I will just leave you with, again, braiding sweetgrass. A harvest is made honorable when it sustains the giver as well as the taker. And I think Ryan and I have learned that through this process, and we have learned that through this presentation. And I am grateful that we are giver and takers in this space. So enjoy your Lughnasadh and continue learning and growing. And we'll see you soon. Goodbye.
Bye.